Why can't the plastic pollution issue be resolved, even after 50 years since we started talking about it? Isn't there a fundamental reason why we can't kick the plastic habit? Hi, this is Takatoshi Shibayama, the host of the Future Design Podcast. In this episode, I have a discussion with Leslie Maliepaard, CEO of the Planning Calls, about the systemic challenge we have against the consumer habits in the industry that feeds our plastic addiction. They're engaged with corporations and policymakers on what kind of fundamental societal transition is needed to move away from plastics. So stick around to the end. Well, thank you very much, Leslie, for being on our show. I've been following you on LinkedIn and other media platforms. I watched your Planet Calls video on YouTube as well, and it was left a lot of impressions on me. You're a lady that's tackling this world of plastics. And what I want to get out of our conversation today is like, what are the hidden forces behind this plastics, and how can we as consumers combat this plastic problem that we have today? And now a lot of times we hear about this circular economy, and to me it sounds like we've been hearing about this circular economy, or maybe in the past everybody was calling it recyclables. That it seems like the same song but just kind of sung differently this time. And I wanted to ask you as well, as why is the circular economy now so important than before, and how is this circular economy and the ideas behind the economy different? Some people actually say, oh, isn't this like some Marxist idea that, you're trying to combat capitalism with this like old idea of Marxism and just painting it as circular economy, or green economy, or whatever you want to call it, but it's fundamentally like a socialist idea, right? And to me, like, I wanted to pick your brains about what does circular economy really mean to us and to you as well.
Taka, thank you so much for that introduction, and wonderful to be on this show, this highly esteemed show. For me, circular economy, there's a very personal connection around it. And I probably have to take you back a few years. I lived in Ireland for 4 years, and often I went for walks along the canals and the oceans and the rivers. And when people think of Ireland, you always think of green and beautiful landscapes. However, I always saw the dark side of Ireland on my walks. I used to go along with my family, and I was always met with a huge amount of pollution on these walks, as well as sewage in the water, and you just wouldn't expect this in Ireland. So what happened was I started a one-woman campaign where I picked up rubbish wherever I went, much to my family's dismay, because I was constantly holding them back as I was, sitting around 10-meter perimeter just cleaning up plastic. And then on many occasions, people from Ireland actually stopped me and said, well done, you're doing such an incredible job, but never once did anyone join in on this. So sadly, the pollution in Ireland has just compounded through the years that I was there. So I started looking deeply into this, and I realized that we needed to make a fix. The society was not managing it. Consumers, we were all struggling to deal with the flow of plastic that was coming towards us, and we weren't able to make those decisions. And this is when I actually became passionate about circularity. I believe that if we implement circular economy principles, we would very quickly start slowing the flow down of plastic going towards the oceans. And this is when I started the Planet Calls. So I wanted to raise awareness around how we should be moving from a linear economy to a circular economy, and in order to cut that flow of plastic down. And in fact, in December, I did a TEDx talk in Luxembourg, specifically around my journey, but also why we are faced with this whole issue of plastic flowing towards the oceans, and the solution really being the whole circular economy aspect to it.
And what did you find from all your kind of research about learning about circular economy? Because I read a lot of books around that topic. One of it was Kate Rathworth's Donut Economy. That left quite an imprint in my mind about thinking about how can we change the economic system so that it'll be more ecological. But from my background, I've been in finance for a very long time, about almost 20 years in finance in the hedge fund space. And I've been always thinking about investments in terms of a very capitalistic mindset. And I think most of our world is still kind of designed around that. So if it's profitability that corporations are going for, and how do you convince companies, that the bottom line is actually not all about the bottom line, but it has to be ecologically conscious as well. Because I was having a conversation recently with another friend of mine, and saying he works in a logistics space, and he's has a lot of factory workers, and they're working at like $15 per hour, and even that small cents or whatever the small amount that they can actually cut down from. So let's say buying a plastic that's 10 cents more cheaper than an actual substitute of that really hits their bottom line as well. So they wouldn't really care if it's plastic or not. They just want to go for the cheapest thing possible. And I think corporations are, similar minded in that sense. They have stakeholders to answer to. They need to think about driving the profit line. So how do we transition, our that kind of economic structure to a one that's more consciously aware of our ecological sustainability?
Mm. I think what's happened is that the world's fallen in love with virgin plastics. And probably for the past 70 odd years, we've been producing mostly virgin plastics. And when I started investigating this a few years back, I realized why. I kind of thought to myself, if we had actually started with circularity at the core of our principles and produced products with circular model in mind, we would have solved all of these recycling problems that we're having today. The fact that we are not able to deal with any of our recycling issues. So if we had to remove the demand for virgin plastic, the demand for oil would cease to exist. And so my whole focus around it was how could we actually stop that flow of plastic, and start replacing that plastic with something that's more biodegradable or alternative, to start introducing packaging that is biodegradable, no longer single use, no longer based on virgin plastic at all, and possibly just something that's been recycled and has stayed in the loop. Because when you have that circular economy model versus the linear, you've got the take make waste mindset. Everything ends up in the bin and then it needs to be recycled, and sometimes the majority of it ends up in landfill or in the incinerator. Then when you have the circular model, you've got that whole process. The product actually never reaches the bin and it just keeps on recycling in that circle. And that's when we stop in that flow towards the oceans and towards landfill and things like that.
Yeah. But I think that when we look at our recyclable plastics, and I had a discussion in our family as well, and said, let's sit down and see what plastics are actually recyclable. And in Singapore, to my surprise, when I first moved here about 11 years ago, and I came from Japan where everything had to be recycled, and everything had to be thrown away in a specific date, so that they were taken to the proper places to be thrown out. Whereas in Singapore, when I first came here, is I dump everything in a trash bin, and it'll just go to incinerators, and it'll go to the landfill, and then create a new little city for us again, in this island. So it's a huge different mindset for me when I first came here. And then even after 11 years, I mean, there's still the concept of recycling is so low level, and nobody really understands what can be recycled and what we can't. And then when we look at the back part, and I think a lot of people can start to notice these, but you have this triangle, of course, with these arrows going around, and it says 1 or 2 or 3. And then it looked at the Singapore regulations around that, and pretty much 1 and 2, which is the PET, the PET bottles that we use, and then the 2, which is the harder form of plastics. Those two can be recycled, but the rest from 3 to 7 and to others cannot be recycled, right? So even the plastics industries are not really making anything so that they can be recycled, even though they show us this triangle with the the arrows going around, making it look like it's recyclable, but in reality it is not. So I think there's a whole industry that the plastics industry or the chemical industry making us believe that what they're doing is recyclable and they're doing something right, but it's actually completely wrong. It's a complete lie. They're not actually making things that are recycled. They're just giving you the image that they're doing something right. So how can we, as consumers, really understand how to tackle this problem from a consumer level versus all these corporate activities that are trying to brainwash us that what we're doing is actually wrong, or they're putting that recyclable mentality on us rather than them.
True. So it's such a good question because I think it all boils down to the oil and gas industry, where they have been driving this plastic linear model for decades and decades. And it's been working for them because they've been profiting from it. But at the same time, the planetary resources have been depleted. So as long as the demand for virgin plastic exists, the demand for oil exists. However, with the rise of the green consumer, things have been changing and people become more demanding around how their products need to be more sustainable and how they need to be produced. So consumers are starting to push back. So when you start rejecting single-use plastic products, this consumer makes a powerful statement to all plastic producers and oil companies. So I feel that the green consumer, which is on the rise, I mean, I started a few years back, and just with the awareness raising that I did around my organization, I noticed that ripple effect of people around me starting to really be mindful around what products they were using, changes they were making to their lifestyle so that it became more sustainable.
Right. And you touched upon the virgin plastics in the oil and gas industry. Over the past decade, shale gas has contributed to a lot of cheap plastics, or the inputs for plastics, and the cost of recycling has never really gone down to that significant effect, at least to combat the cost of oil. So more and more of these companies are creating cheaper and cheaper virgin plastics, and the recyclable plastics are probably going to sustain itself in terms of price, are much more expensive compared to virgin plastics. So as I just go back to where I was saying, is that the plastic industry is only thinking about the bottom line, and they're going to push out cheaper and cheaper plastics to us more and more. And you're saying that from a consumer side, we need to reject these single-use plastics and virgin plastics, and demand more recyclability of plastics, right? And at the same time, we need to have these recyclable facilities in order to handle that as well. In Singapore, we actually don't really have that many. Actually, there's only 3. If I might be completely wrong, but there's only 3 incinerators in this country, and then there's only maybe one alternative that handles recyclable plastics and other things. Obviously, I'm not just talking about Singapore, but globally, we need more facilities to handle the amount of the gargantuous amount of plastics. And I don't think that the governments or even the plastics industry have contributed to give us more and more options to throw away plastics in a more sustainable way. And what have you through your activities have noticed about government policies and other corporate policies about creating more recyclable facilities for us to accommodate the amount of plastic garbage that we're throwing out?
Yeah, I mean, from my side, I mean, having been in Ireland, we discovered that the recycling done there, every piece of plastic was discriminated. Whether it was tainted with food, it couldn't be used, or it was a bottle that had 2 different PET plastics on it, also couldn't be used because it was still attached. And also, you can go back to the product was actually poorly designed because it's containing 2 different plastics, which makes it even more difficult for the recycling company to separate. So a lot of the plastic that we were putting into our bin so diligently was still ending up in landfill because it couldn't be used. I'm now living in Austria, and quite interestingly, it's become a lot easier to recycle because the Austrians don't discriminate against plastic. So whether it's soft plastic or hard plastic, it goes in the same bin. And I suspect, and I'd actually love to be able to visit a recycling plant to see what's going on, is that it all just gets melted into one big pot and gets used up for whether it's recycled or for a particular oil or something like that. So that would be interesting to see how the Austrians are handling it, but it's nice that that's been made available. So I know that, let me just say, I don't particularly have a big issue about incinerators at this moment in time, for the pure reason is that it's actually solving the pollution problem going into the ocean. So I prefer to go into an incinerator, and an incinerator that's been designed beautifully in the sense that, you know, it's containing the heat and it's containing the toxins that they don't get emitted into the atmosphere. So I'd prefer to end up in an incinerator rather than in landfill, because landfill that stays there for decades and decades, polluting the earth, and also eventually being, you know, running off into the oceans as well. So for now, it is a great solution. I know, I can't remember if it was the Swedes or the Danes who had that big incinerator, which they've also turned into a ski slope. So they've got this incredible plastic consuming monster, or pollution consuming monster, that they're literally running out of pollution. They cannot feed this incinerator enough. And like, what a beautiful problem to have when you've cleaned your environment so much that you're now looking elsewhere for pollution resources. I mean, that's what we need in Ireland. Whereas in Ireland, everything I still believe is a lot of it's ending up in landfill, or recycling companies are not recycling it as they should be.
Mm, yeah, and when you talked about, you know, China stopped importing plastics, and most of that now comes into the rest of Southeast Asia here. It goes into Malaysia, it goes to Vietnam, it goes to Thailand, and probably majority of the ocean plastics that you see is coming out of Southeast Asia. They can't even handle their own plastic problem, and then get imported a lot more plastics from, you know, Europe and US and elsewhere. Even Singapore is shipping out their plastics into these you know, Southeast Asian countries, and most people in Southeast Asia, without, you know, proper facilities of treating these plastics, they usually end up in the ocean, or they just get burnt in the nearby village, or they just, generally people just throw it into the rivers, and, you know, they end up in the ocean as well. So do you think that, you know, our governments around the world, and I think this needs to be a concerted effort by all governments to handle this problem, but, you know, when you have, you know, I just said those Swedes or Danes are having this monster facility that can treat plastics that want more plastic, versus there are countries that just can't even handle their own. How can they work together to have a global standard or a global understanding of where to allocate plastics and where can they treat these plastics? Because it doesn't seem like everybody's on the right on the same level. I mean, one country's even leaving, you know, the Paris Accord and going out on their own, right? So like, even, you know, if one country's or leader doesn't even believe in climate change, how can we even, you know, tackle the plastic problems? So yeah, that's kind of what I think.
Yeah, it's an incredible question. It really did make me think. Um, it's been 2.5 years now since China's stopped accepting recycling material for processing. And I think with anything in life, things have to get a lot worse before they get a lot easier. And so 2018 and 2019 have been those years of plastic crisis. And we're still not through it, because we still have that massive, and I'm sure the numbers increased, but it's 350 million tons of plastic heading towards the ocean each year. So I know that luckily there are some progressive governments that are starting to take a stance on plastic production and pollution. And I think we're always going to have non-participators when it comes to solving global challenges. And as you said, you know, we can't even agree on climate change, and there's governments that are rejecting it. So we're never going to be able to align a synchronized global action. But I think what's most important, the lesson here, is that it would be amazing if all governments could collaborate, but I feel that we can't wait for everybody to join in. You actually have to start your own journey. So each government in their own way and in their own time, you have to find their way in how to solve the plastic pollution crisis. So as we do it as a consumer, you know, you make those changes and you influence your peers. If governments did that as well, they'd also influence their peers. So if you just make the decision to lead the way, the rewards will be infinite than if you actually had to wait for someone else to act. So I mean, a few years back, I mean, I studied this issue for a long time, and I coined this phrase called the pincer effect. So I'm a Cancerian by star signs, so I have my little crab feet, and so it comes from the sea crab, quite ironically, because isn't that where all the pollution is? So when the whole idea is that you want to tackle the solution from both sides. So you get to slow the tide on plastic pollution by turning the tap off at the top where the plastic is being produced, as well as catching the plastic at the bottom. So that's when it's in the ocean and you need to be picking up. So when more governments and corporations, sorry, let me just start that again. When more governments and corporations and individuals around the world make a stance on plastic, the sooner we get to move from a linear model to a circular model.
Right. And so let's talk about the circular model and or a circular economy as well, because as I kind of alluded to in the beginning, to me, if it's not for the corporations, if it's not at the bottom, I think governments are quite the same as well. Like, let's create a circular economy, but obviously, if it doesn't really affect positively the bottom line, then it's hard for them to get on board as well. And I personally think there's so much as consumers ourselves can really make a huge impact. Of course, I think the biggest strong force ever will be the consumer side, but getting every consumer on board is going to be hard. We need to also start tackling the corporate side as well. How do you think that we can, as consumers, as well, and affect the governments to get these corporations to change the way they they go about creating these plastics in our world? And I also touched upon a little bit that the pricing is also around plastics has gone against our favor as well, right? So, trying to create a circular economy with governments, corporations, and individuals like us all on board, it seems like a very colossal, problem to attack. But we really want to, get at to the bottom is that there's so much lobbying and so much power from the oil and gas and chemical side corporations that it almost makes it really difficult for us to really transition into this circular economy.
Mm. I think the short answer really is policy and penalties on these corporations, and I think that has started in some governments. They've been more progressive around it, and I try and support them wherever I can. And ultimately, if the corporations are going to win the green consumer, which is on the rise, there will have to be a paradigm shift from the linear to the circular model. And, you're always going to find business cases and financial models that you can now profit from in a new circular mindset. So I think you have to take a long-term view on this. Planetary resources are finite. And once our natural materials have run out, there's no planet B. We know that famous image of there's no plan B. But how will anyone profit then? And this is why, you were asking that question of like, is there money for corporations in this new world? And I do believe that there is money in circularity. When corporations would shift over to a sustainable business principle at the core of their businesses, and they're focusing on the 3 P's of the triple bottom, that's people, planet, and profit, the money does flow. But that switch over does have to happen. I think if we don't do that, if corporations are not doing that switch over, they are the ones that are going to be suffering in the end, because they're the ones who will have lost their consumers, their trust. They'll have products that they can't sell. So I do find that a lot of companies who have been in the industry and are starting to adopt new principles are finding that their new green ranges are way more successful because of the clued up green consumer.
Mhm. And is there any way that we can learn a little bit more about those 3 Ps and how it's beneficial for corporations to look at their business model much in a longer term basis than the short term? Because as you know, most companies are only answering to investors who are looking at short term. And as you said, our world is definitely finite. It's not infinite, and we can't consume like the way we're doing it right now. And but there has to be something in it for the corporations to get on it as well. And Is there something that you read before, or you've noticed people talking about something in depth that we can learn a little bit more about how corporates can really benefit off of this circular economy?
I think a big one, we actually have a partner we work with who helps with that change for corporations to go towards circular economy. And where the saving is they are able to reduce the waste that is produced by adopting circular principles. So literally they can take like 100% waste down to 20% waste. And with that, either the waste gets sold, recycled, or an alternative solution is found where the corporation is able to profit out of it as well. But at the same time, what's really interesting is I'm finding that when leaders of these corporations are making these changes, they have all the stakeholders, the internal and the external ones, have a greater buy-in to that corporation's products and services. So, what an incredible place to be in when you have employees who are so passionate about your business and the product behind it. I think there must be nothing worse than an employee working for a corporation and they feel at their core there's nothing sustainable around it. And when you have that systemic belief, it ripples into the businesses as well. So, for me, with the Planet Calls, I try and tackle the issue at the top with the leaders and the investors and the board members, and I call it investor activism or stakeholder activism. And I'm a strong believer in that. And that's why at the Planet Calls, we only choose to work with leaders who are ready to systemically change their businesses to adopt sustainable principles and implement those into their business models. So yeah, I think we are able to shape those leaders in that way. You also create a cleaner, healthier, and more sustainable world.
Hmm. And are there things that when you discuss with these corporate leaders that obviously you only talk to people who are already on board, but do you find that some ideas that you tell them still they struggle to really grasp the concept, or at least kind of incorporate into their business model? Because conceptually, yes, we all have to be ecological and think about sustainability of our planet, but once it goes into the kind of corporate model, then there might be a mismatch somewhere. And have you found anything like that?
Yeah, I mean, we've worked with companies who actually produce sustainable products but haven't implemented sustainable principles into the core of their business. And that was interesting. But with the influences of we doing with our advocacy work at the Clinical Calls, it was brought to their awareness that actually they needed to start changing their ways. And so that was already a positive change, seeing this corporation come to us and say, what can we do to boost our image, and how can we make those changes? And that's when we can bring our circular economy expert in to help with that transformation.
Mm, mm. Yeah, obviously, I think it really looks good for the company. And I think we've seen this with the CSR and ESG and stuff. And a lot of times it feels like it just kind of, spins out of control because it's not really, it's just like a branding thing and it never really gets really implemented. And that's what I worry about this whole circular economy too, is that, we've talked about, recycling, and probably, you were brought up in South Africa. When I was a child, I was in the U.S., and back in the 80s and 90s, we heard recycling so much, and I did visit the supermarket many times with bunch of plastic bottles to recycle, and I'll get some money back from doing that. And I'm sure a lot of people remember who lived in that time still remember the governments and everybody telling us that we have to recycle. But then here we are again, like 30 years later, still tackling the same problem, but nothing has really happened. And I am worried that it's the same thing going to happen over again. Maybe in like 20 years another thing is going to we're going to still be talking about the same thing. So what can we do right now that we can really finish this off pretty much once and full, and not to repeat the same thing over and over? And I think that's why you're also passionate about this as well.
Yeah, no, it's a very thoughtful question. I think both have a role to play here, when we're looking at technology helping you and consumers, like who can make the biggest change. And having personally been that consumer who's been a slave to fast fashion, me always soothing myself and saying, okay, recycling is going to solve the problem. It's fine. As soon as I put it in the bin, the solution's there. But this all changed after I saw all the street and water pollution in Ireland firsthand. So that changed my mindset completely, and I started the whole movement with the Planet Calls. But what I wanted to do was maybe take a look at the food industry, an example. I mean, every consumer has the power to vote with their wallet by choosing sustainable products as well as adopting green lifestyle habits as well. So by so doing, you actually directly affect the food producer's bottom line. And I've seen it happen in Ireland instantly. I was part of a group of maybe 150 people on WhatsApp just in my neighborhood. And there were often talks were going, okay, today we're going to go to Tesco and we are going to remove all the packaging off the products, and we're going to leave it there at the tools because they don't have the facilities to accept the packaging from the products. And we're going to say to the managers, please start pushing back at the producers and asking them to supply sustainable packaging. And so a lot of people would start doing things like that. That is extreme because obviously it creates other issues with the supermarket, where now they've got plastic waste and we don't know if they responsibly recycle, removing that plastic waste. But at least the voice was there, and they were, a lot of times, as I said, voting with their wallet. Other things that consumers can be doing is they can be choosing to shop in places that are already converted. Zero waste food stores. You naturally take in your net bags or your own shopping bags and those sort of things. Supporting your local producers versus the international ones, buy in season, not out of season. And I see a lot of that here in Austria. The packaging is getting a lot cleverer. And the people, just our neighborhood, are so dialed in terms of what to buy. And, they're very strict in buying in season and something that should be in Austria, that is produced in Austria. So we love our wine. So we instantly, when we arrived here, we just placed a big order for mostly Austrian wine. Wherever we could, we just said, okay, Austrian wine, we're going to support. And it's just fantastic to be able to support the locals. I mean, I live in a farming area, and I walk down the road to get my olive oil. Not that it's produced here, but I've got my neighbor who's sourced it, in bulk. Pumpkin seed oil is also just down the road here as well. And we just walk everywhere we can to source the local produce from them as well. So I think those are the sort of things that the consumer can be doing, so that we can vote with our wallets and effect that change with the supermarkets and then the producers of food or any sort of product that relies on plastic.
Yeah, I always hear that, when confronting global conflicts or global issues, the problems are so huge that one individual seems like it's impossible for us to make any impact. But just doing something very individual, just by, as you said, like rejecting plastic containers and wrappings, and choosing with our own wallets to make an impact. When more and more people will do the same, then it creates a much bigger movement and affect the way the corporations will have to interact with their customers. And I find that in Singapore, and excuse me, but most of our listeners are in Singapore, and it's because it's a small island nation, we don't really produce that much in this country. And everything is imported, whether it be from Malaysia or Australia or from Europe, anywhere. And every single thing comes in plastic wrappings. And if we start to, strip away all the plastics that we have from the produce that we get from overseas, I mean, the supermarkets will be stacked from floor to ceiling with plastics. And for people in Singapore to make that stride into a more circular economy, or at least feeling conscious about our throwaway culture of plastics. You definitely live in a more I hate to say this comparing to Singapore, but like more advanced way of consciousness towards ecological matters in this world. How can we for like the people in Singapore to really get on this move? I mean, if you have any advice, I'd be really happy to hear something like that.
Yeah, I mean, Take, if you have the ability to reach some bigger businesses and even SMEs, because as we know, SMEs are the backbone of any economy, and we can always work on those businesses to help with their transformation, and that really is bringing in an expert who can help reduce that waste that's been produced. And also to really pinpoint where the linear model is and where you can switch to circular. As people need to obviously be willing to change. I mean, you're not going to make the horse drink water, once you've led it there. But I think more and more with the visuals that we see in the news and the devastating news about, marine animals dying everywhere you see, more and more businesses and people are going to be pushing back. And, you being in Singapore, you're obviously surrounded by water. So when you're seeing that effect of what all that plastic's doing to the oceans, there's that motivation already. But it always has to be an emotional thing, because once you're emotionally connected and you know that your child is growing up in this world, and you're leaving them a planet that is completely polluted and has no live animals, that really hits home. And I think that's what's going to start converting a lot more people. But, there's a lot of innovations and technologies out there that address packaging, offer sustainable packaging. So it's really just tapping into, I mean, we can certainly help with identifying startups and later stage companies who are already providing all these circular economy solutions. I mean, we have, I think it's about 1,400 startups and later stage companies on our database that are offering sustainable solutions, so whether it's circular economy, biodegradable plastic, waste eating robots that suck up plastic in the ocean. All of those things are all available. So yeah, if you do know of industry that we should be talking to, then we must definitely go ahead and start those discussions as well.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I have picked up a couple of companies in Singapore as well, not particularly just about plastics, but in the broader sense of helping our planet to be a lot more sustainable. And some companies are working on stem cell technology for cell-based meats or cell-based dairies. We had two guests on our show that were talking about that, and then we have a couple more in the backlog that we discussed about these topics. But yes, I mean, in Southeast Asia, Singapore, we live in a very somewhat advanced economy compared to the rest of Southeast Asia. But when we go to on a vacation, and this was something that we did with my family, we go to like Bali or some other beach locations. It's full of plastic. I mean, it saddens me all the time, because I used to go to Bali and all these other countries, 10, 15 years back, and it was much more pristine than it is now. And I walk the beaches with my son, and we pick up plastics and throw it out. And I tell them, you cannot throw plastic in the ocean because it doesn't go away, and maybe turtles might eat it. And we talk about all these things a lot, and it's a great way to educate them. If everything was all picture perfect, then there's no opportunity for them, for me to teach them about these things. But at the same time, it's sad that we live in this kind of reality as well. So I think that trying to get more people to understand about this, especially in this region, because most of the plastics come out from this region, and a lot of people are still not aware that this is the region for plastic pollution. That we need to get people on board to understand that we have to tackle this problem now, not 20 years later. Also, Singapore, we have this landfill that's supposedly going to be filled up within 15 years. So we don't have any other solution unless we build more recyclable facilities to get rid of all this waste, because we're not going to dig a hole in the ocean again and start filling that again. So, I think that our time is quite limited. And I'm sure you believe that as well. And more and more that our environment's getting worse and worse compared to the 70s, 80s, 90s, and we need to tackle this a lot faster than we should be.
Agreed. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much for your time. And then, you touched upon various companies that are innovating. So I definitely want to do an episode with you to talk about these new innovative technologies that are tackling plastics and all sorts of pollution that's happening around the world. So, it was a very short time, but thank you very much for your time, Leslie.
Taka, thanks. Let's do that, because I think if you offer solutions to people, it's a lot easier to transition and make those changes. And often we feel, as business owners or governments or consumers, we feel helpless because we actually don't see solutions. We're all just seeing problems. And I try and not be the problem solver. I try to be the solution finder.
Awesome. All right.
Thanks. Okay. Lovely talking to you today.
Yeah, lovely as well. Thank you very much.
Hi, this is your host Takatoshi Shibayama. Thank you for listening all the way to the end. Now, if you enjoyed or disliked this show, please let me know by writing in the comment section. The only way I can improve or add value to you is through your voices. If there are any topics that you would like me to pick up, please also let me know in the comments. I'd love to start chatting with you all. And if you would like to continue watching the show, please subscribe. Thank you.